Hello and welcome to the second of the Sociology of Work and the Professions lectures, the first of them which goes virtually online. For today's class we're going to have a little look at some of the history of sociology as an academic subject, as an area of study, how it developed, where it came from, all that sort of thing. And look at two main early thinkers within the sociological movement, Marx, who was by far the earliest, and into the 20th century on to Michel Foucault, who also applied his ideas to issues connected to work and employment, although he also applied many other ideas to many other areas of life as well. And from there we'll move on to thinking about Pierre Bourdieu's arguments around the notion of habitus and how work shapes life, gives structure and form and order to life, for better or for worse, as the case may be. Now, in terms of the historic backdrop to sociology, as you hopefully remember from perhaps your first year, well, I appreciate that's going back a while now, sociology emerged with both the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution, and the period of enlightenment that came about following the French Revolution, when people were reflecting upon applying scientific ideas and concepts to the study of a whole raft of issues, including human nature and human society and how we all kind of converge together. Whereas in previous centuries they've been more interested in applying religious ideas and concepts to those same areas and those same issues. So that shift from thinking mainly in a religious way to thinking more in a scientific way. They didn't abandon the religious thinking entirely. Obviously there's still a lot of religious people in the world today, but the gradual shift, particularly we could argue at the higher levels of society amongst those who are in charge and organising and structuring the way the world is. So if you think back to whenever you last saw a British politician on TV talking about some policy that they were in the process of introducing, the chances are they would have tried to justify that policy with reference to research and statistics and scientific data, particularly with something like COVID as a very obvious example where medical scientific information is highly relevant. They would not have tried to justify that policy by reading you a quote from the Bible or talking to you about the Quran or the Rig Vedas. So they wouldn't have referred to a religious text and religious ways of thinking. The default go-to way of thinking and justification for many things, particularly by those in positions of power these days, is scientific, and that's the result of the Enlightenment. So sociology comes about in that process, that shift in a way of thinking in many parts of the world, and it takes a while to reach some parts of the world as it gradually kind of ripples out stage by stage by stage around the world. But now we're into 2020, you would be hard pressed to find anywhere really in the world that doesn't think in that kind of a way. Possible exceptions might be very isolated tribes in the Amazon and places like that, but by and large most places are thinking in an Enlightenment style manner. There were shifts in the philosophy of science, philosophy of knowledge. We won't go into those too much depth at this juncture, but if it's something that really interests people, I can create a separate podcast for you to listen to at your leisure, because both the philosophy of science and of knowledge are quite involved subjects. The philosophy of science is how we understand what science is, how we justify it, how we develop a sense of the appropriate uses of science, where it's acceptable to use, where it would be irrelevant to use, how scientists should go about carrying out their research, the ideas underpinning the whys and wherefores of it. In a similar way, the philosophy of knowledge relates heavily to those concepts of epistemology and ontology that you will hopefully remember from your first year, in which we try to justify how we know something, what are appropriate ways of learning about something, what are the suitable routes of knowledge for different subjects. So to use sort of the example I've just given, if I want to know about chemical reactions in the brain, should I learn about that by applying scientific methods of research, testing, retesting, examining the biology of the brain, or should I open up the Bible and read a verse there? Or should I go and consult the local tarot reader and see what they have to say about the matter? What would be an appropriate method of finding out knowledge of that particular subject? Now, I'm hoping you all instantly say the scientific method, because clearly that's the appropriate thing to take for learning about the chemistry of the brain. But there may be other occasions when you want to know about a subject when you wouldn't use science, you would use a totally different method of knowledge to find out about that subject. And so the philosophy of knowledge deals with that. And by asking these sometimes challenging, sometimes awkward questions, the movement came around to start thinking about a whole raft of issues, including society. How do we know what people are like? How do we know about how people behave en masse? Do they behave the same in every single society, or do French people behave one way, Italian people another, Zimbabwean people yet another, Australians another again? So if we look at different parts of the world, do we find the same patterns, or do we find very different patterns? Do men behave differently from women? Do young people behave differently from old people? All of these sorts of issues were contemplated and explored and examined within early sociology, and led to people asking questions about how you would go about learning about society, what would be an appropriate method to test, because a lot of the ideas in sociology are quite difficult to put to a test. So the way in which sociologists approach knowledge and study and theorizing can be quite different from the ways in which psychologists approach those same things. So all of these questions began to be asked, and by asking them and thinking about answers, people from different disciplines began to shape and form the very idea of what is now sociology. One of the big areas of study was how people live, especially in cities, more so than in villages or very small market towns. How do they live in cities? So the whole process of urbanisation, which happened in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution, when a vast chunk of the British population, and likewise in other countries, shifted from living in villages and working on the farms to living in cities and working in factories. And so the idea of the driving force behind this massive, massive change in society that we're still living with now, obviously. We compare the size of, well, I live in Ipswich, so compare the size of Ipswich today to the size of Ipswich 300 years ago. And it's vastly bigger now than it was then. And that is largely a result of this shift in population from village to, well, Ipswich isn't a city, but a large-scale town. And a lot of it is driven by needs of employment. And so the idea of there being a very close link between sociology as a subject and understanding the impact of work and employment, particularly industrialised employment. People working in factories, and then as a result of big factories you ended up with big hospitals, a larger number of big universities. Now, Oxford and Cambridge had existed long before the Industrial Revolution, but the scale of universities across this country and the world in general began to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and there were more and more of them. More colleges were set up. All sorts of institutions that previously had been fairly small became larger and larger and larger as a result of huge numbers of people flooding into the cities and needing to accommodate huge numbers of people in hospitals, in universities, in schools, in all sorts of areas of life. Much the same time as we're having the Industrial Revolution and in this country to start with and then rippling out across the world. And the French Revolution, we're also seeing an expansion of colonialism as European powers march across to India, to Africa, to every corner of the world. It's very easy to think of colonialism in an entirely Western context, which is a serious mistake. China is a colonial power and has occupied areas in the eastern or southeastern regions of the planet. So India is a colonial power and occupied large areas of land around what eventually is now India, but was at various other times different countries that have gradually amalgamated to form one country. So colonialism has existed in pretty much all parts of the world at different points in time, but obviously because we're tending to think of these subjects more from the British point of view, we're thinking in terms of British and other European forms of colonialism at the moment. But that led to a sense of globalization, that you could go into a market in Britain and buy food that had been shipped in from far-flung countries on the other side of the planet, where produce was grown or made that previously most people in this country would have known very little about. The super rich might have known about it, but the middle and working classes would not have known about half those products until the growth in empire meant things were being spices and fruits and foods and textiles and pottery and all manner of things were being shipped backwards, forwards and sideways. So you could look at, if you're interested in this kind of area, look into the history of tea and the production and growth of tea, which indeed led to two massive wars in China to force the Chinese people to grow and trade in opium, because we wanted to swap opium for tea, and the Chinese emperor was being very resistant to that idea, and so there were two quite horrendous wars to pressure the emperor into caving into chiefly British and then in time French and other European nations' demands. So global trade, again we're thinking business and trade and work and employment, has a huge impact on things like warfare. Not just on what you can buy and what you can sell down at the local shops, it impacts in all sorts of other ways as well. When we're thinking of central areas of interest and study, as we get towards the end of the Victorian period, sociologists who, under the influence of Marx a few decades earlier, had been heavily interested in the workplace, that was his big domain of interest, but they also start to, by the end of the Victorian period, think about empire itself, concepts of nation states, how politics works on the grand scale and influences people. And as we're getting towards the end of the Victorian Empire, you've got the emergence of the suffragette and suffragist movements, the demands from women, well, middle-class women and then working-class women and working-class men to have the vote and to participate in the nation-state in ways that they had previously not been allowed to participate. And of course the wish of women, and then eventually the middle-class women, and eventually the working classes as well, to be able not only to vote but eventually to stand for Parliament and participate even more directly in the nation state. And that's when we begin to get ideas of notions of surveillance. How do governments keep an eye on their populations, what they think, what they do, how they behave, all of those sorts of issues, which leads us eventually into the middle of the 20th century and Michel Foucault, who was exceedingly interested in concepts of surveillance. But we'll get on to him momentarily. Hopefully you will be by now familiar with the name of Simone de Beauvoir as a central figure in pushing feminism into different directions. Feminism had existed before she did, but she took it off into different directions. Frantz Fanon we don't tend to talk about a lot, or at least not in the first and second year. You'll hear more about him as you go on to this and other modules in the third year. He was very interested in colonialism and the impact of empire, particularly in Africa, and explored notions of how Europeans view black people and how black people view themselves, and indeed concepts of racial identity in all sorts of different directions, and how living in a colonized country that's dominated by some foreign country impacts on you as you grow up and you sort of experience life in that country. How does that shape the way you think, the way you feel, the way you produce art, the way you produce music, the way you engage in politics, the way you do all sorts of different things. So some of those ideas we'll come back to later on in this module, and also in the gender and sexuality module after Christmas. Now, hopefully you'll recognise Michel Foucault in the photograph there, and some of these terms you will have heard in previous years, and you indeed might have read books or listened to podcasts or something like that. So if you would like to pause the video, get yourself a coffee, and think about these terms and what you know of these terms. If we were in class, I'd be putting you on the spot a bit and asking you to give me some feedback, but just because we're doing this virtually, have a pause, have a think. Are there particular terms on that screen that you really don't know, or at least you don't remember? Because they'll be the ones worth jotting down to ask questions about during the Q&A. Now, assuming you've paused it, got your tea or coffee, come back and restart it, we'll just briefly, very briefly, go over these chief concepts from Michel Foucault, what they mean and how they're applied in different contexts. When he talks of discipline, what he means, which is slightly different from the way that word is used in other contexts in general life, he means that governing authorities in any given institution. So, for example, he spoke a lot about prisons. He was very interested in prisons. And the ways in which the warden and prison governors set up regimes to discipline the prisoners. Now, he's not talking about kind of punishing them any more than they already have been by putting them in prison. When he talks about discipline, he's talking about this idea that people have physical energies, obviously. We kind of get restless after a while. A bit like, you know, if you've got small children, they can only sit still for so long before they want to be up and doing and running around and playing and one thing and another. It's not a lot of difference for an adult that we need to be physically active. I know there are some people who are about as active as a three-toed sloth, but by and large most of us need to be physically active. We have a lot of energy. It needs burning off, and if it doesn't get burned off, people can frequently become restless, become agitated, and if you're in a tightly controlled environment like a prison, the last thing you need is a lot of angry blokes or angry women, if it's a women's prison, getting agitated and kicking off, starting arguments with each other. With the kind of situations and personalities you have in a prison environment, that could easily lead to violence, or on the bigger scale to a full-on riot. So he said prison governors try to come up with ways to control the bodies of the people there, to discipline their bodies in the sense of getting them used to certain ways of doing things, and also to burn off surplus energies to keep them calm, keep them more manageable. He was looking at techniques used in earlier centuries in prisons as well as in 20th century prisons in his own lifetime. So, for example, if you look at Victorian prisons, they often had these giant wheels, a little bit like a kind of hamster wheel, really, in which prisoners would have to walk for hours and then just going round and round and round this big old wheel. Sometimes they would be used to power things within the prison, but as often as not, it was just to tire the prisoner out. Likewise, getting them to turn crank handles, which often didn't connect to anything. They weren't achieving anything by turning the crank handle, except tiring themselves out. Some prisons have got people doing hard labour, and still do in some parts of it, breaking rocks, digging ditches, all sorts of heavy-duty manual labour, which might bring in a bit of money to the prison, but chiefly, more than anything else, it's about tiring the prisoners out. So they're not then getting angry and restless and stroppy, they're just tired when they get back to their prison cell and flop down in the bed, and they're quiet, they're manageable. He was also very interested in mental illness and how mental hospitals, psychiatric hospitals run. And you can look at regimes of managing patients in psychiatric hospitals. Sometimes the rather heavy use of sedatives for patients whose mental health is not benefited by sedating them. It's more to do with keeping a large number of often disruptive people fairly quiet and sedate. Well, literally sedating them to keep them sedate, so you can just sort of put them in a corner and it makes them a bit more manageable. If you were a primary school teacher and you had 25 youngsters, you would probably very quickly want to come up with things they could do, games they can play, sports, running up and down the playground, dancing to music or something or another. They could do as much to just wear them out so that they're then quieter and calmer and easier to manage than expecting them to sit for prolonged hours at a desk doing maths or history or whatever it is, and getting more and more bored and more restless and more disruptive. So that's discipline. Biopower and biopolitics go hand in glove. Biopower is exerting your control over other people's lives. When I say your control, I don't mean you particularly, but in general he's talking people in a position of authority, governments and so forth. Biopolitics are the tools used to exercise that power, usually through policies and systems introduced mainly by governments or other people in authority, like church leaders, for example, to try and regulate what people do with their bodies in various ways that are presumed to be beneficial to the goals of whoever it is that is in charge and setting these rules and regulations in the first place. So I'll give you a couple of examples of biopolitics. The money, the benefit that you can claim as a parent for each child you have up until they reach adulthood, that policy was introduced to try and bump up the population after the First and Second World Wars, when the population had drastically reduced through the deaths in war and the problems afterwards, and the Spanish flu after the First World War, which killed vast numbers of people. Suddenly the population was dropping, there weren't enough people to do all the jobs that were needed to be done, and so there was a push to encourage families to have more children. One of the stumbling blocks to having more children was lack of finances. A lot of people were living financially on the edge, and so the government said, well, we will pay you so much a week per child, and you can spend that on food and clothes and one thing and another. So that gave the kind of buffer, the comfort zone, where a lot of financially strapped parents thought, well, okay, we can afford to have another child now, because the government policy, the biopolitics, is now enabling that. Likewise, if we go into China, and they have changed the policy in recent years, but if we go back a couple of decades in China, the government there introduced the one-child policy for the exact opposite reason, that there were far too many people around and they needed to reduce the scale of the population, because China is a gargantuan country with vast numbers of people. So their policy of saying if you have more than one child, then you will be penalised financially and in various other ways to discourage families from having more than one child. So that's two examples of biopolitics. You can include things like the NHS is a very good example of biopolitics, keeping people alive, keeping them fairly healthy, and chopping and changing decisions made over the decades by successive governments. Should you include dentistry as part of the NHS? Should you include opticians as part of the NHS? What should or should not be in the NHS? It's all part of biopolitics as to what a government wants to improve and control and regulate in the health of its population, and what it feels the population should sort out for themselves. Discursive practice is the arena of talking about a subject. That is discursive, to talk about a subject. But it's not just anyone talking about a subject. It ties into this notion of a regime of truth, that in any given subject there will be people who are seen as having more authority to talk about that subject, more expertise, more insight, more understanding than other people do. And we could put this at a very kind of day-to-day level. Let's say you wake up one morning and you've got aches and pains in places you never used to have them, and a rather peculiar looking rash in a place where you never used to have a rather peculiar looking rash. Who would you turn to for advice? Some of you might be thinking you'd go to your GP, because who else? You would see that as a medical problem, and you would therefore go to a medical expert, your doctor. And for most of us, we probably can't afford to go and hire some flash Harley Street private doctor, so we'd go to the local GP at wherever the nearest medical surgery is that we're signed up to. Would some of you consider phoning the NHS advice line and describing your aches and pains and rashes to some random person on the other end of a phone? You might. Some of you might be thinking, well, you'd go online and you'd look up some kind of medical website. Some of you might be thinking you would ask a particular relative or a particular friend whose opinions you trust when it comes to health-related issues. So there could be different people you would turn to and discuss, you have that discourse, with about that, those aches and pains and rashes. Now it's possible, of course, you might not interpret your rash and your pains as a medical issue. If we go back a few hundred years in this country, and quite a few hundred years in this country, somebody in the situation of finding the rash might think to themselves, have I been cursed? Now, I had an argument with that weird old woman who lives on the edge of the village yesterday, and I wake up this morning with a rash. Has she put a curse on me? And therefore you might, or that person in 500 years ago, might interpret the rash not as a medical issue, but as a magical issue. And who would they go and talk to? Well, they might go and say to the old woman, oi, have you cursed me? Or they might go to the priest, the vicar, and say, I think a curse has been put upon me. Look at this rash. Do you think it's a curse? Do you think it's magic, or do you think it's something else? So quite who they would consult would depend on, well, partly who was available, and partly who they imagined would be an expert in what they interpreted as a magical issue rather than as a medical issue. So part of discursive practice and the accompanying regimes of truth connects to how you interpret an issue in the first place, before you even decide who to talk to about it. Is this a medical problem, a religious problem, a political problem? Is it a financial problem? It could be all sorts of problems that you think this issue is connected to that subject matter. And therefore, I need to engage with someone who knows about that subject matter. Discursive practice also includes the idea of how we engage with certain subjects. So if any of you are, for example, Catholic, or at some point in your life you were Catholic, even if you are not necessarily at this moment in time, then you'll be familiar with the act of confession, of going into the confessional box in a church, and of talking to a priest and making confession, and then the priest advises you how many Hail Marys you need to say, and so forth. There is a formula to that, a way of talking to your priest. You have to use certain phrases, your priest uses certain phrases back to you. There is room for going off at tangents. Your priest might ask you various questions and give you a little bit of advice and counselling, as well as saying, say, 10 Hail Marys, or whatever they're going to say at the end of it. But there is a particular format to how you engage in that discourse. There's a practice to it, a way to do it. And the way you talk to your priest in the confessional is different from the way you talk to your priest in the supermarket if you bump into him when you're doing your shopping and you're just having a chat with him about the weather and you know, the price of baked beans today, or whatever it is you're talking to him about. It's a very different style of conversation, a very different way of talking to someone. If you were going to go and talk to your local MP because you need help with some issue or another, the way in which you would approach them, where you would meet them, you'd have to book an appointment, you'd have to go to their office, and you'd be allotted a certain amount of time, and you'd need to present your case very concisely because the clock's ticking, and they would take on board your issues and say whatever it is they're going to say to you in exchange. There is a certain way. You wouldn't go, well, hopefully you wouldn't go bursting into the MP's office going, "Oi, you!" and swear and shout and rant and rave, because clearly the MP isn't going to be very sympathetic to someone who's being very loud and sweary. However, if it was you having a conversation with your drunken mates down the pub, you might call each other rude names and get loud and leery, and that would be seen as perfectly fine in that situation. So the practice of how you talk to someone depends on who they are, depends on the particular situation in which you're in, such as whether you're in the confessional box with a priest or you just happen to bump into him in the supermarket. It depends on what you want to talk about to that individual person. So there's all of these different styles, and as a sociologist, Foucault was interested in understanding how people learn the different styles, how they use the different styles, how sometimes those styles change over a period of time, how different people engage with ways of talking, exploring, learning about, expressing themselves, responding and listening to others. That whole process interested him. The regime of truth we've already mentioned because it overlaps with discursive practice. A regime of truth is an accepted truth about a particular subject, a particular way of understanding the world, which incorporates the notion of authority. Who is it that is allowed or seen as the correct person to have an opinion on a given subject? So let's say a friend or relative is seriously ill. Hopefully this isn't going to touch too many raw notes, but let's suppose they've got something like cancer. And you're having a chat with them, you know, they're pouring their heart out to you. And they're saying, well, what do you think I should do about it? Who would you recommend them to talk to? Would you say, go to your doctor, go up to the hospital, talk to an oncologist, a cancer specialist, take the medication they give you, follow the regimes they advise to you, etc., etc.? Or would you say, there's this woman who lives at the end of my street who does crystal healing, and if you go to her she can put crystals on you and cure your cancer. Or there's this faith healer who's coming to my church next Sunday, and if you go along he does faith healing in the church and that might cure you. Or do you say something else entirely? The regime of truth that you operate under, because there isn't necessarily one singular regime of truth for anything, there are competing regimes of truth. This is something that really interested Foucault, the idea of the competition behind different regimes of truth, are connected to people who claim, rightly or wrongly, to have a lot of insight into a given subject, and how the people listening to those claims respond to them. So the doctor, the oncologist at the hospital, claims, by and large rightly, to have an insight into how cancer works in the body and what kinds of medicines most effectively treat it and so forth. But then so do some faith healers. So do some people who engage with complementary and alternative medicines. And some of them may be very good at what they do, and some of them may be complete fruitcakes. Just as some doctors are really good doctors and some doctors are quite terrible at what they do. So within any given regime of truth, there will be some people who are, shall we say, more skilled at doing what they claim to be able to do, knowing what they claim to know, than others. But who are you most comfortable with talking to about a given subject? And some of the examples that Foucault gives are changing regimes of truth. So the idea that 1,000 years ago, if someone in the village were ranting and raving and seeing invisible forces that nobody else can see and behaving in a very, very strange, peculiar, disturbing way, they were most likely to interpret this as some form of possession, devils or some other kind of spirit possessing that villager. And the regime they'd most likely turn to would be the church, because the church was seen to be the specialists who understood issues like demonic possession, what to do about it, how to exorcise the demons, and cure that person of their disturbing behaviour. These days, in 2020, we're much to, at least in this part of the world, to interpret that kind of very odd delusional behaviour as mental illness, and we're much more likely to turn to psychiatrists, to the medical world, for the regime of truth, and feel that the doctors will be the ones who know best how to deal with this situation. There are some people who would still see it as a demonic issue and go down to their local pastor or minister or vicar or what have you. But by and large, the majority of people are more likely to interpret that kind of very unusual, disturbed and delusional behaviour as a sign of mental illness than as a sign of demonic possession, and to regard doctors as the correct regime of truth rather than to regard the church as the appropriate regime of truth to turn to. The epistemology is the issue of how you know which is the correct regime of truth to turn to. And for Foucault, that was a lot to do with your upbringing. What you're being taught was the appropriate authority to turn to if you have this problem or that problem or some other problem. The issue of surveillance is the idea that in any society, the people in authority need to know what's going on. It's very difficult to maintain authority if you've got no idea what's going on. And therefore they need to keep track of what's going on. Now, it could be a tiny village in the middle of Africa, and the headsman or headswoman, as the case may be, keeps track of what's going on in the village simply by listening to the gossip, keeping their eye open. It's a small village, it's very easy just to see what people are getting up to, and so they know what's going on, for good, for bad, and they keep track of it that way. What if you are living in a vast city the size of New York with millions and millions of people? You can't keep an eye on people in such an easy fashion. So at that level you have to start using other techniques, such as technology, CCTV cameras on corners, monitoring their online activities in Hotmail and Facebook and Twitter and wherever else to find out what they're saying, what they're thinking, what they're doing. You might, like President Ceausescu, who ruled over Romania a few decades back, have a network of spies who feed back into your central spy agency. They tell the spy agency what's going on in their local neighbourhood, and eventually someone in that agency filters it up, at least the interesting bits at any rate, to the president, and the president finds out what's going on in the country. There's all sorts of different levels and ways of keeping an eye on what's going on with people. Now, at one level, that's to help them, to monitor problems, but it's fairly obvious that surveillance can very easily turn sinister, where an authority is monitoring what's going on in order to manipulate, dominate, control the population for their own good, rather than to help the population in question. And it's not just at a government level, it's your employer monitoring what's going on in the company. Your teacher monitoring what's going on in the classroom, the local scout leader monitoring what's going on in the scout group. And it raises questions as to who should be monitoring what. Whose job is it to monitor this, whose job is it to monitor that? So, for example, there is an expectation on all teachers these days, which never used to be the case going back a few decades, but the expectation that if a student starts singing the praises of Al-Qaeda or the National Front, not that the National Front exists anymore, but what is it called these days, the BNP or whatever they've changed the name to, then teachers are meant to monitor this and report it to the authorities in the school, who then pay closer attention to, is this student being radicalised? Once upon a time, go back a few decades, and there was no expectation that teachers should be paying any attention to their students' politics. Instead, they should be focusing on teaching maths or geography or chemistry or whatever subject it was that they were being paid to teach. So again, this is an example from Foucault's perspective as to who is in charge of surveying what, and who do they report to, and what happens with the information once they pass it on up. Poses some curious questions. The group task, which is something we can chat about in the Microsoft Teams, or whatever it is that we're using, I forget now. But we can also talk a little bit about this next week when we meet in person, is to pick one of these. I was going to suggest you form groups, pick one of these, and think about how discipline and regimes of truth and so on operate with, and surveillance particularly. Who is surveying what? How does it work? How does it operate? What should it be in your ideal world? What is it in practice? And discuss one of these four environments in terms of Foucault's ideas. But I say we can do that when we're online together chatting, as well as in person next week. Chap in the photograph here is Achille Mbembe. Mbembe is an ardent admirer and follower of Foucault. Mbembe comes from Cameroon, which at one point in history was a French colony, and Michel Foucault is French, so there's an area of Cameroon which is French speaking, which perhaps gives an insight into why he's got this great passion for Foucault, because he comes from a French-speaking part of the world, and there's great admiration for French philosophers in that part of the world. So Mbembe builds on and adds to ideas that Foucault proposed. So whereas Foucault was talking about biopower and biopolitics, the control of life and the introduction of policies and measures to improve health and control the size of the population and those sorts of issues, Mbembe says that most governments the world over, if not indeed all governments probably, are just as interested in controlling death, necro is the Greek word for death, as they are in controlling life. And just as they exercise necro power, the control over death, so they introduce policies and procedures, necropolitics, to regulate issues to do with death. It's a quite a big, wide-ranging philosophy he has on this issue. We'll come back to it later, and if it really interests you, I'll do a separate podcast just on him alone that you can listen to at your convenience. Or possibly a seminar or something like that we could do potentially. But the short version gives you examples. Death can be managed actively or passively. Now, when it's actively, that's very gruesome extreme examples like the Nazi government rounding up gypsies and Jews and gay people and what have you, and carting them off to death camps and concentration camps to, well, basically slaughter them in vast numbers. That is active necro power, and the politics saying if you're Jewish you'll be rounded up, if you're a gypsy you'll be rounded up, etc. The procedures that they put in place, like the gas chambers, the transportation, the use of cattle lorries and densely packed trains and so forth, all of that is an example of necropolitics, the actual way they went about doing it to try and obliterate, they succeeded in obliterating vast numbers of people. And obviously it's not only the Nazi regime that has done that. There are many governments across the world who have tried to obliterate a whole section of the population, and done so sometimes with greater or lesser success than other governments in terms of whether they have actually carried out their policies or not. There's also this more passive approach to necropolitics and necropower, in which the governing bodies are not murdering people, but they are abandoning them to what is probably an early death. And a very obvious example of that in this country is homeless people. So no one is, which does happen in some parts of the world where they go and round up the homeless people and shoot them. That does happen. Obviously it doesn't happen here. But if someone is homeless, they're likely to suffer malnutrition, dehydration, a whole raft of illnesses that might be contracted from living on the streets, and the risk of violence and hypothermia and one thing and another. The chances of them dying very young compared to whatever age they might have died at had they been living a more conventional life in a house is a marked issue. And so by not helping people in that position, just sort of leaving them there, that is a passive form of necropolitics. It's the decision not to have a policy to help them, not to invest the money, not to set up state-run homeless shelters and so forth, just to chuck them on the streets and leave them. Now, we've had the situation during the first lockdown in coronavirus where government money was put forward and made available to local authorities to get homeless people off the streets, put them in B&Bs and hotels and what have you, as a measure to keep the wider community safe from possible infections. But that's in some cases been slightly short-lived in as much as once the first wave of coronavirus died down, a lot of that money was withdrawn, and a lot of those homeless people were then told, well, your time's up, you'll have to go back on the streets. There are lots of other examples. Mbembe is much more interested in, for example, global political situations. Talks a lot about war zones, for example. Who is left in a war zone to take their chances as to whether they live another day or not, or whether someone goes and drops a bomb on their house and kills them. The notion that there are zones of death where governments have effectively stopped trying to keep people alive and just walk away, whether it's to do with war or plague or famine or droughts, a variety of issues where people in an area are just left. And Mbembe says that this is an expression of whose life is valuable and whose life is not. In other words, who is it in society that a government will try and keep alive by spending money on them and introducing policies to help improve their condition and improve their chances of living a good old long life? And which sections of society does a government just write off as not being worth the effort of keeping alive? And sort of effectively shrugs its shoulders over them. It's quite a grim area. He uses this phrase of the living dead to describe people in the condition where the government has given up on them and just left them to their own devices, where they're very likely to succumb to warfare or illness or violence or something or other that will end their life early. So they're not necessarily dead right at this minute, but there is a high chance they might be quite soon. Quite grim. And what's this got to do with the workplace, you might ask? Well, if we think in terms of health and safety policies, they are an example of biopolitics. How do we keep our workforce healthy and alive? Now, a lot of that comes from government, but also, of course, individual companies will have their own variant policies. So when both Foucault and Mbembe are talking about authorities, they don't only mean governments. They also mean employers, managers, anyone in a position of authority over others. What do they do to make sure their staff, their employees, or their customers, as the case may be, are kept alive and healthy? Equally, are there occasions or examples where they're basically writing people off and saying, well, if you die, you die? So to give you a unpleasant example, at least it will be unpleasant if you go and look this up and see some of the photographs and images. Back in Victorian times, in this country, we had matchstick making factories. Well, as they did in other parts of the world as well, not just this country. But the example I'm going to give you is from this country. And Bryant and May, still in existence obviously as a matchmaking company, during the Victorian period they started making matches with a type of phosphorus, which is the match head. White phosphorus was extremely dangerous to the people who worked in the factory. Now, most of the people working in the factories were women, because this was a very low-paid job and women would work for lower rates than men, by and large. Not that the men were well paid, they were just badly paid men and really badly paid women at that juncture in time. Those women who worked in the factory for any length of time were exposed over the days, the weeks, the months to the effects of white phosphorus, which I'll try not to be too graphic, but basically it causes the bones, particularly the bones in the jaw, to start dissolving, and it eats away into the flesh and the skin of the face. And if somebody works exposed to that type of phosphorus for too long a period, then basically they'll lose their lower jaw and it will just be like a kind of flapping bit of flesh. Incredibly painful, and the ability to eat, the ability to talk, it is pretty much gone. And there was an alternative type of phosphorus, a much safer type of phosphorus that didn't cause those problems, that could have been used to make the matches, but it was a bit more expensive to buy, and therefore the price of matches would have gone up and profits would have gone down. And so Bryant and May, who owned this factory, refused for years and years and years, despite lots of protests from the women who worked in the factories and the men who worked in the factories and other people. Despite the protests that, look at the state of your staff, they said, no, if you want to go on working here, tough luck, put up with it. And you'll get sicker and sicker, and a lot of you will die, but just kind of put up, shut up, get on with it. Eventually, the almost entirely female workforce went on strike, which is the first known strike in history, the first recorded strike in history. They succeeded in shutting down the Bryant and May factory for a period of time, and there was a big newspaper hoo-ha, big scandal, and lots of people who read the papers found out about how horrifically injured the women were as a result of this phosphorus. And the scale of the scandal eventually did succeed in pushing Bryant and May to use the other type of phosphorus, improve the health of their surviving staff. They did treat these striking women appallingly badly. They've been treating them pretty appallingly when they were working there, even more so when they went on strike. So they were not a good employer, not good people to work for. At least not at that point in history. That's an example of an employer, an authority, engaging in necro-politics and necro-power, effectively saying, I am not going to change policy by using this alternate substance, because my profit margins are more important to me than the horrific illnesses and early death of large numbers of the workforce. And I guess going through the minds of Bryant and May was the idea that if those half dozen women over there on that factory line, if they all die off early, well, there's loads more I can employ tomorrow. They're just easily replaced. And it's treating human beings as a commodity. One dies, well, so what? You get another one in the next day. As if they're no more important than a manky bit of machinery that needs a new screw or a new bolt, and you just chuck the old one out and put a new one on. That's about as much value as human life had in that scenario. Leap forward into the 21st century, I'm sure we could sit and think of various examples, you might be able to think of them yourself, but cases where human life is of so little value to the employer that people are left in all sorts of highly dangerous situations in this country and in other parts of the world. And you can also factor in the customer angle. Do we as customers buying products necessarily care very much about the life expectancy, the health, the living conditions of the people who manufacture the products we buy? So if we discover that some article of clothing is made by 6-year-olds in a sweatshop in Bangalore, do we refuse to buy it, or do we think, oh well, it's cheap, I'll have it, and so what if 6-year-olds are being made to work in 12-hour shifts in a factory? If we find that the jewellery we would like to buy is dug out the earth by slave labourers who are frequently being killed by cave-ins because the mine is so inefficiently run, so badly run, there's no health and safety or anything in that part of the world, do we refuse to buy the jewellery, or do we say, oh well, it's nice, it's a nice bit of bling, and I'm just not going to think about the people who have suffered and died and been horribly injured in one thing and another in digging these diamonds or rubies or whatever they are out of the earth? Which is branching it out beyond the kind of areas that Marx and Foucault they were more focused on the people in authority, the owners of factories and so forth. This is branching it out beyond them to say that do we, the ordinary buying public, have a moral duty, or do we abandon our moral duty, or is it nothing to do with us? Is it entirely resting on the shoulders of either the owners of these factories and mines and what have you, or resting on the shoulders of the governments who pass the laws that regulate what go on in factories and mines and so on? Where does the burden of responsibility lie? Does it even lie in only one place, or is it a kind of a multiple number of places where we've got to have different people taking responsibility for what they do in different regards? Something to think about and discuss. I imagine some of you will certainly have quite strong views on those sorts of issues. Another pause for thought if you want to go and get yourself another coffee and put the video on hold. Can you think of other examples? It could be work-related, seeing as this is a work-related module, but you might also think of other areas outside the remit of employment where certain lives are worth much, much, much less than other lives. And maybe those lives are abandoned in a sense, so that if they die, no great effort is made by whoever is in a position to be making the effort to keep them alive. What about after work? By which I mean retirement, rather than just going home at the end of the day. Is there a significant effort to keep retirees alive so they can enjoy the fruits of their retirement for years and years and years? Or are they just kind of left, or even, as perhaps the suggestion on the screen, sometimes there is almost an active wish to reduce the numbers of certain people, certain groups of people? Can we see that at play when it comes to retirees, or is that just me being a bit melodramatic? Have a think about it yourself, and we'll discuss these when we're chatting away online. Now, assuming you've had your tea and you paused for thought and you've turned it back on, we'll come back to Marx. We've mentioned him already. He was a massive influence on sociology, still is, even though some of his ideas are perhaps quite outdated now. He's perhaps the biggest reason why such a vast swathe of modern day sociologists, academics and those working in other professional fields are very, very left-wing. There are some right-wing sociologists and some centrist sociologists, but they're very few and far between, and are seldom heard from when it comes to public platforms and arenas, which does create a very imbalanced approach to sociology, but perhaps that will change over time, although I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. Marx's assessment was initially made in the various factories and industrialised regions of Victorian Britain, where the vast majority of the people who worked in those places were working ridiculously long shifts, exhausting, back-breaking shifts, doing heavy-duty, high-risk manual labour, high risk in terms of the low standards of health and safety. Children getting caught in machinery, adults getting caught in machinery, cave-ins in mining, all that sort of thing. Killing and injuring people quite frequently. And were being paid an absolute pittance for the hours they worked. Men and women alike, and children, of course, at that point in time, vast numbers of children worked to make a living, to feed themselves and clothe themselves and so on, and contribute to their families, where they had families still alive. The wages were abysmally low. And he was interested in understanding the kind of misery and suffering those people experienced, and trying to work out ways to set them free, to liberate them, to improve their living conditions, their working conditions, their general life conditions. Some of his ideas he took from Hegel, and we'll go on to Hegel in a future class and explain some of his concepts and how they apply to this particular area within sociology. As far as Marx was concerned, the problems he saw in factories and mines and various other places of employment reflected the huge social divisions he saw in society between the aristocratic elite, the incredibly rich lords and ladies and dukes and earls and duchesses and what have you, and the vast majority of the rest of the population who were desperately, desperately poor. There was a middle class, the doctors and barristers and so on, but they were still fairly small in Victorian times. The middle class wasn't a large sector of society, it was still a fairly small sector. So the vast majority of people were either what used to be referred to as the respectable working classes, in other words, the ones that were paying the rent and putting clothes on their back and food on the table, and those who were barely managing to do either. Not because they were bone idle and lazy, but because they were just so dismally paid and lived in such squalid conditions that it was nigh on impossible to get out of them. So for Marx, society could be understood as a conflict between the haves and the have-nots, between the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor. And his argument was that the extremely wealthy were, for the most part, extremely wealthy because they were ripping off the extremely poor by not paying them decent wages. There were one or two people who became extremely wealthy without exploiting anyone, like Charles Dickens, who, a little bit like J.K. Rowling's these days, went from having very little money when he was young, hardly any money at all, and living a fairly rough and ropey life, to becoming this massive literary sensation, who was, by the end of his life, incredibly famous and in high demand, and made an absolute ton of money, and lived a very good lifestyle towards the end, which he achieved without ripping anyone off or exploiting them and so on. So there are examples of people like that, but Marx, by and large, felt that most people who had immense wealth had attained it at the expense of those who were left with very, very little for themselves, just kind of scraping an existence. And his idea, which is something that has remained a key feature in sociology, is that in studying society and the way factories and aristocracy and the working classes and all the rest of it operated and functioned, he didn't just want to describe it. He didn't just want to churn out books saying, this is what it's like, folks. What he wanted to do was change the system. So the purpose of describing it, analysing it, understanding it, was only step number one. Step number two was coming up with methods of transforming society to make it fairer, to spread the wealth more evenly, to liberate the desperately poor from their squalor and their misery. And so he felt that sociology as an academic subject should be revolutionary, not merely descriptive. And that's remained the case, I would say, for every single sociologist on the planet ever. But for the vast majority of sociologists, that remains the idea that they're not simply describing society, they're trying to improve society by whatever means they think is appropriate. Now, obviously, what one person calls an improvement, someone else might consider a nightmare, but it's an improvement as they see it. So feminist sociologists are not just describing the situation of women, they are wanting to come up with methods to improve the situation of women. Critical race theorist sociologists, which is a very trendy thing these days, are not simply describing the situation of different ethnic groups within the world, they're wanting to improve and change the position of those ethnic groups and the relationship between varied ethnic groups within the multicultural society. So it's not description, it's change and transformation, which might influence why you choose to study sociology. Are you hoping to change the world? Maybe not all of it, but a bit of it at least. Is there some area of life which you, in your career after university, which is only a few months away, are hoping to be able to change and improve and make society a better place? That's something we can talk about when we get the chance to chat next. Kind of seeing how you view your future, what you want to do. Is there a particular area of sociology you really want to go on to study, maybe at master's level, with the hope of instigating some kind of change, some kind of an improvement in the world? Be interesting to hear. Now, back to Marx again. Marx spoke German, amongst other languages, and often used German to describe various concepts and ideas. This particular term, Gattungswesen, wasn't invented by Marx, it was borrowed by him. It's a term stemming initially from Feuerbach, who wasn't a sociologist, he was using it in a different context. But Gattungswesen is what he terms species being. That's the sort of more literal translation from the German. The essence of what it is to be a particular species. So you could say, what is the essence of being a dog? What is the essence of being a zebra? What is the essence of being a haddock? And various other different creatures. But obviously Marx had no interest in answering any of those questions. He wanted to know what is the essence of being a human. And Feuerbach had his own views on that one. Marx was less convinced by some of the arguments of Feuerbach and didn't see humanity as a wholly biological thing. Now, he wasn't in total denial of biology, but he felt that biology was much more flexible than a lot of people allowed. He didn't believe in the soul, he was an atheist. So he didn't see there being this kind of fixed, hardwired core to humanity. He saw us as much more like clay or plasticine, something that could be shaped and moulded into different forms, different guises. The key force that did the shaping and the moulding, he felt, was work. Now, had he been, let's say, living 100 or 200 years later, he might have argued something else. There are sociologists these days who would be more inclined to say, no, it's not work, it's gender. And others would say, no, it's not gender, it's race. And others would say, oh, no, it's not that, it's this. So there's different arguments made as to what the big factor is. But for Marx, work shapes our human nature. So it's not so much, at least it wasn't in his lifetime, so much the case that you're a very kind, caring person, so you go and get a job as a nurse or a doctor or something where you can be kind and caring. Rather, it's you get a job and then the job turns you into a certain sort of a person. So you might not have been terribly kind and caring at the start, but the job turns you into a caring person as it goes along. Or it turns you into a very tough person, or it turns you into a very attentive person, or a very inattentive person, or whatever it might be that you get turned into. The job makes you, rather than you being drawn to a job that fits your character. That could, we might want to pause for thought, be an element of social class there. if you're desperately poor, you take whatever job you can damn well find today. And so maybe you have to adapt to whatever job you can get. If you come from a better off background, you might have a little bit more luxury of choice over what kind of a job you do. And particularly so if it's the sort of job you need qualifications for, because you've got to choose to go and do the qualifications. We could shunt this argument, or extend it a little bit at any rate, to say, is it just the working environment that changes you, or does education change you? So if you go and study medicine, does the act of studying medicine, even before you get qualified and become a doctor, does the act of studying medicine change your character and mould you into a medical type personality? Or the act of studying sociology mould you into a sociology type personality, even before you get the employment? But as far as Marx was concerned, his focus was on the employment end, not on the educational end. So we'll stick with that for the time being. There might be jobs that you can think of that you've had in your life that you feel have shaped you, changed you, turned you into a different type of a person. Or maybe you've had taken up a job, felt you were being pressured to change, didn't want to change, and so quit the job and did something else instead. Perhaps chuck out a few examples of your experiences there when we're chatting. He didn't feel people could be changed beyond all measure. He felt that there were kind of limits. You can only stay awake for so long, you can only exert so much energy, you can only split your attention in so many different directions. There's only so much you can do before eventually you sort of reach the limits of your malleability, your capacity to be shaped. And there is the argument that some jobs maybe have such ridiculously high expectations that they push people beyond their breaking point by expecting more of them than is reasonable to expect of anyone, any human being. The law, Marx felt, obviously comes into play to a point in terms of employment law, especially these days when we've got a lot of laws about health and safety and working hours and that sort of thing. And so government gets involved with the region of business to shape laws and rules and guidelines around who can work, what age do you have to be to work, how many hours you're allowed to work, what the rate of pay is, health and safety regulations, all that sort of thing, which have an impact on human nature, but also reflect the lawmakers' perception of what is good or bad for a human being in the first place. So their view of what humans are capable of and not capable of, to start with, will begin to influence and shape the kind of laws they make. So there's a sort of a circularity going on there, which is worth a thought or two when we're discussing these ideas. Marx also spoke about the idea of commodity fetishism, which is the notion that a commodity is something you buy and sell, something you trade. It can be an object, like buying a loaf of bread, or it can be a service, like hiring a plumber to come and repair your leaky pipes. But in either case, one person is selling the object or the set of skills, and the other person is paying for them. And so that object or that set of skills has a price tag on it. It has a value, a fiscal value. Marx felt that capitalism, particularly the type of investment capitalism that came into existence with the Industrial Revolution, turned virtually everything into a commodity, a thing to buy and a thing to sell. There's a current sociologist, philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, who we'll get onto him in more detail as we go along. But he is very much a Marxist, very much part of that outlook. And he says this is even more so, way more so now in the 21st century than it ever was in Marx's own lifetime, where everything is commodified. So you buy experiences. You can, if you're Christmas looming around the corner, you can buy someone a ticket for a trip on a hot air balloon. You can buy them a day as a zookeeper. You can buy them all sorts of experiences, and it's now being sold as a more worthwhile thing, as an idea. Buy a person an experience rather than buying them some ornament or a book or some object that's going to gather dust. Can you buy love? Well, you can certainly buy a facsimile of it, but there are people who will pretend to be your girlfriend or your boyfriend for an evening if you want to go out for a meal and have someone to talk to. So not necessarily prostitution in the sense of sex afterwards, but they will kind of give an illusion of a romantic experience. There are people who will pretend to be your friend if you hire them to do so. There's all sorts of weird things that can be bought and sold now that weren't at an earlier state. And one of the aspects of commodity fetishism is not just the buying and selling of objects and services, but Marx's fundamental idea that ultimately capitalism, investment capitalism, is buying and selling people. Not quite in the slavery sense of the old slave markets, although I say old slave markets, there are actually more people on the planet now enslaved than there ever were in the 17th century. But Marx wasn't talking about slavery in that sense. He was talking about what another one of his admirers, Mikhail Bakunin, referred to as wage slavery, where you do get paid and technically you are free, but to all practical intents and purposes, your employer virtually owns you. He certainly treats you like something that they own at any rate, and they can command in that sort of a way. To give you an example of how this could be thought of as working, when you're filling in a CV, applying for a job, going to the job interview, there is an extent to which you're trying to sell yourself, to say, I am a person worth hiring, hire me. And is hire me a euphemism for buy me? Don't overlook me, don't gloss on to the next candidate. Look at me, there's something about me that's so brilliant that I've put in my CV, or I'm dazzling you at an interview, that you're really, really, really going to want to pay me however much the job pays and take me on board as a new member of your team. We are selling ourselves. Does that mean we've got to sit and think of ourselves as a commodity? So you start, and this is where Marx comes in, he says you get into the frame of mind where you think of yourselves more and more as a thing, an object, a product that has a price tag to it, to be bought and sold. How much is an hour of your time worth? There was it Naomi Campbell? I think one of the supermodels anyway, who once said in an interview something along the line, "Oh darling, I don't get out of bed for less than 10 grand. It was very nice for her, I'm sure. What is your time worth? Yeah, the time of a brain surgeon is arguably worth more than the time of a dustman. So who is establishing the price tag? The employer, the employee, the competitive marketplace? How do we know what a particular skill set is worth in terms of an hourly rate? What am I worth? What are you worth? What is our price tag? So it's thinking in those contexts. The element at the bottom there, we go through fads and fashions in CVs, as with everything else, and there has been a fad to, supposedly in a bid to combat discrimination, supposedly, that things like your ethnicity, your age, your name even, because your name potentially might give away whether you're male or female, might give away if you're Asian or Chinese or British or whatever you might be. You might have a name that makes obvious certain features of you and your demographic characteristics. Should all those things be stripped away from the CV so that the people reading them and deciding who to come to summons for interview and who not are making decisions based on qualifications rather than whether this is a man or a woman, whether they sound Asian or they sound African or they sound French or German or whatever they might sound. One of those other factors that nowadays is largely considered to be irrelevant. Although there might be some jobs where that would not be considered irrelevant, but that's a side issue. Or do you think it was better when a CV simply said all of those things about you and you kind of take your chances with an employer that they're not going to be rampantly sexist or rampantly racist, but just hire you because you are, or at least give you an interview at least, because you're a worthwhile person with a good career background and a relevant set of skills. When Marx was talking about the capitalist market, the sort of workplace, the buying and the selling, he said fundamentally this whole idea of having to sell yourself at interview, or these days it would be in the making of CVs. I don't honestly know if the Victorians made any use of CVs at all, but certainly we obviously do these days, is reductionist. It robs you of your humanity. And a lot of the arguments made about market forces, kind of things you can hear politicians discussing, the market forces require this, the market forces require that. To a point, economics, yes, maybe the money is going in this direction, not in that direction this month, and next month it will change again. But it loses sight, Marx felt, of the fact that we are fundamentally talking about human beings. Human beings who have skills like plumbing or carpentry, human beings who make things like bread and sell them, human beings who need to earn a living, feed their families, put clothes on their back and a roof over their head. Human beings who can't necessarily work every hour God sends and collapse in exhaustion, who want to go home occasionally and see their families and have a quality of life outside the workplace. Has this changed significantly since Marx's lifetime? One critique of Marx is that his theories are an accurate description of the mid-1800s. They're not necessarily wholly relevant, and some people would say at all relevant, to life in the 21st century. So it'd be interesting to hear whether you think he is very much dated, or if you think some aspects of his theories and ideas are still as relevant today as they were back in the middle of the 1800s. How do you feel in your places of employment? How do you feel as a student? Are you a product with a price tag and a market value? Or are you treated as a human being and recognised as a rounded, holistic entity? Now, when we move on to talking about the ideas of Philippe Bourdieu, a French sociologist, he speaks about the notion of habitus. Habitus is the Latin word for habit, where we get habit, customs, habits, things you do on a regular basis. And Bourdieu says that life is structured in a whole raft of different ways. One massive, significant way in which life is structured is work. And so we can understand work as structuring life into three big categories. There is before you get a job, and bear in mind that go back a few centuries, well, not even that long, in British society, and still very much the case in a number of parts of the world today, as soon as you can stand up, you're out in the fields working alongside your parents. So the idea of childhood being a period of time before you get a job is a very Western idea and a very modern idea that doesn't apply historically and doesn't apply currently in large swathes of the world where 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds are working and earning money, because that's just the way it is in those parts of the world. But over here, childhood is pre-employment, and so you go to school and you learn various skills and subjects and topics and whatnot, and then into college perhaps. Not everyone does, I know, but some people. The skills you learn are increasingly, certainly of recent years, more and more oriented to what is going to be useful to you in employment. So it's not learning for that kind of Renaissance love of the subject, or learning a subject because it makes you a decent human being necessarily, although I suppose you could argue that the PHSE, I've got those initials in the right order, kinds of subjects are about that. But an awful lot of it is, how can we make this relevant to employment? Especially so when we're teaching adults. So when I'm teaching maths, a lot of it is not abstract, pure maths. It's about the kinds of maths related skills you could use in daily life when you're shopping, when you're baking a cake, when you are at work. How would you use numbers and maths then? It's very work focused. Then you become an adult and you apply for a job and you get a job, unless of course you're so rich you don't need to, and that's a whole other situation. Or maybe due to severe mental health issues or severe disabilities, something like that, maybe it's very difficult for you to get a job and keep a job, and that becomes a whole other discussion in itself. But we spend a hell of a long time, and as the retirement age gets pushed up and up and up, that period of time gets longer and longer and longer at work. And so a large number of hours in our day, and days in our week, and weeks in our year, and so on, is accounted for by work. Last week we were discussing this idea of time off, free time, spare time. Those notions only exist because we have accounted for time. Time owed to someone who pays us money to do stuff. But there are women, still lots of women in the world today, who want to be housewives and mothers, who don't want to work, who want to spend time with their kid, or looking after their husband, or indeed their wife, if they're lesbian or bisexual. Do we view, which was obviously the traditional way of women in decades past, for those women who still like that, who still want that, are they viewed in the same way now in 2020 because they don't want to be in the workplace? Are they viewed in a more negative context, or a positive context, or an indifferent context because they opt out? What about a man who opts to be a house husband rather than an employee? How are they viewed in the wider social context? For Bordeaux, it's not only structuring your time that you have to get up at this time and you have to turn up at your office or factory or wherever it is that you work at that time, and you can have a lunch break at this time, and you're allowed a 5-minute fag break at that time, and you can go home at another time. So it's not only the kind of structure of time in that sense, but also it structures your social life. So you spend a lot of time with people you're not related to, people you may or may not like. You might make friends at work, you might go socialising with people out of work, or maybe you're really antisocial like I am and you don't like doing that. But it starts to shape those kinds of areas of your life. There are some people who will take up hobbies and activities they don't give a damn about, but they only do them for social climbing. It's someone who's bored to death by golf but goes and does it because they know their boss likes golf and they're trying to suck up to the boss to get a promotion. And so it's not only shaping the time they're at work, it's starting to shape the time they're not at work. And obviously with a job like I've got, I don't just stop working when I walk out the college. I'm lecture prepping of an evening, I'm marking essays, I'm doing this, that and the other at the weekend. So it's not simply that kind of 9 to 5, clock on, clock off in certain jobs. It consumes time. Then you get to the point of, if you're lucky and you live that long, you get to the point of retirement. What do you do after work? And this notion that there is such a thing as retirement now. Once upon a time you would have had to work till you died, or were physically incapable of working and hope you had a relative willing to look after you. But now we are in the position where we expect to stop working at some point in our life. If you're very rich, it might be a lot earlier than if you are struggling financially. And so you make plans for what to do afterwards. Or I'm going to take up an allotment, I'm going to do gardening, I'm going to go on a saga world cruise, I'm going to do this, that and the other thing. And people who don't plan at all often really suffer physically and mentally in retirement because they feel lost. And that's a big issue because a lot of people, their very sense of who they are, their identity is tied up with employment. They have become, in a Marxist perspective at least, a commodity based on the workplace. And when they're no longer needed in that context, they don't know who the hell they are anymore. There are other sociologists with a slightly more positive take on that, but from a Marxist point of view, it's an expression of the fact that you are owned body and soul for the vast majority of your life. If you live to old age, the chances are, especially as retirement goes up and up, that the biggest chunk of your life will have been spent at work, rather than in childhood and rather than in retirement. And obviously the older you get, maybe you start to slow down. Some people don't, I appreciate, but by and large people do. And eventually it's the preparation for death. So the structure of life, of your social existence, becomes dictated by employment. Other things as well, I'll give you examples of other things to think about momentarily, but Bourdieu says, on the one hand, you can really resent work. You can, every time the alarm goes off, you're moaning and swearing and thinking, oh God, not that place again. And it can be a real drag. But on the other hand, we need structure. There are other sources structure can come from, but wherever you get it from, we need structure. We are not good as a species at just schlepping around doing nothing in particular. Therefore, work, even if you don't especially like it, the type of job you're doing, nonetheless will provide a structure to your life on a daily basis, a weekly basis, and further on. So you're planning your weekends, perhaps your days off. You are planning your holidays and times when you're not at work. Or maybe you're one of those workaholics who can't stop checking their emails, can't stop answering mobile phone calls, can't turn off. Even when you're on holiday, you're thinking about work. One way or another, good, bad or ugly, it is having a hell of a big impact and shaping, forming, structuring your life. Quite markedly so. There are other sources of structure, and something I'd like you to think about in order to discuss next week. Pick one of these, ideally one of these that is part of your life. So if you've got a strong religious belief, you might pick religion. If you're mad keen on your dogs and cats and whatnot, you might go for pets. If you're keen on sports, you might go for that, etc. Think about how that area of life provides structure for you. So to give you a very quick example, let's say you're a Christian. Well, that might mean that on a Sunday you get up at a certain time and you go to church, and you know the service will be finished at a certain time. Maybe you participate in a Bible study group on a Wednesday or whatever. So there may be ways in which your religion shapes your life, that at certain times you do this and at certain times you do that, and there's Easter and there's Christmas and Whit Sunday and the rest of it. And so you could think about those ways in which one or other of these things, like getting up to walk the dog and that sort of thing, the ways in which these things shape your life, what you do and how you do it, whether you enjoy doing it or you hate doing it. Either way, it takes up not only time, but maybe mental focus, because you've got to think about stuff and plan it. Maybe you have to go and buy special things like buying dog food. So again, you're planning financially, you've got to make a trip to the shops, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. How do these things shape your life? Very quickly and briefly, Carl Menger proposed the idea of subjective wants, and we'll come back to this and related ideas from other people in a couple of classes' time. We have certain key wants: clothes on your back, a roof over your head, a chair to sit on, food in your stomach. But we can also be manipulated into wanting things that are not particularly necessary. In fact, we look around our houses. I'm looking around my house at the moment. If I had to survive at the bare minimum, I could do so without the vast majority, probably 99% of the things in my house I could survive without, but I like having them. The marketplace, Menger said, is influenced by supply and demand, but demand can be manipulated, can be controlled and guided and inspired. You can be convinced you want something that 5 minutes earlier you didn't want, you didn't even know was available, let alone want it. And so that this kind of meeting point between I want this and I'm willing to pay for it, does anyone else have it to sell? Is there enough of it to go round or not? Or does the price skyrocket? Are all factors that influence the marketplace. And when it comes to selling your abilities and your skills and your time, that's one of the subjective buying and selling elements. Is there an employer who wants to buy your skill set? Or I say buy it, hire it by the hour. Is there somebody who wants to hire your time to provide a particular service? Maybe there are lots of people who want to hire your services, maybe hardly anyone wants to hire your services in that area, and so you have to perhaps adapt yourself, remarket yourself in a different direction. We'll get much more into the sales pitch, marketing, advertising side of this later on, and the notion of people being manipulated into buying things they possibly don't want, or not buying things they possibly do want because they're being told they are wrong things to have and convinced not to want them. So it can go in either direction. But the key point here is it's not just about buying sofas and tables and clothing and bread and one thing and another. It's about buying and selling people as providers of skills and providers of services, makers of things, and how we go about marketing ourselves, promoting ourselves, selling ourselves. Do we do it well? Do we do it badly? Should we do it at all? But then it would be remarkably hard to survive in this society if we didn't, which is a key issue. Which brings us, thankfully for my throat and your ears, to the end of this particular session. So next week, when we meet in person, woohoo, we'll explore some of these ideas and chat about them, but we'll also get on to Weber and Durkheim and discuss the issue of whether social class in 21st century Britain is old hat. Is it a dead and gone thing, or is it still very much present? If it is present in the same way it was 200 years ago, or has it mutated into something different? We'll also give thought to this idea of what constitutes work and what doesn't. So that's kind of bringing in concepts like charity work, volunteering, housework, doing the hoovering and the ironing. Is that work, or is it not? Is it in the same context as paid work, or is it not? All those sorts of interrelated issues. But that ends today, and I look forward to having a chat with at least some of you online and seeing you all in class next week. Take care.